She did not whisper love like other women. She spoke of children, of forever, and watched a broken man finally fall to his knees. The wind came down from the mountains that autumn of 1878, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early frost. It was the kind of wind that made a man think about shelter, about warmth, about the things he'd been running from for longer than he cared to remember. Caleb Mercer had been drifting for 7 years, 7 long years since the war ended, and left him with nothing but a fast horse, a faster draw, and a heart that had turned to stone somewhere along the bloodied roads of Virginia. He'd crossed rivers and deserts, worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and slept under more stars than any man ought to count. But he'd never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. That changed the day he rode into Thornwood. It wasn't much of a town, truth be told, just a main street of weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of houses scattered like seeds thrown by a careless hand. The kind of place most drifters pass through without a second glance. But Caleb's horse threw a shoe just outside the livery, and fate, as it often does, had other plans entirely. The blacksmith was a barrel-chested man named Samuel Dawson, and he worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime shaping metal. His forge glowed like a sunset, and the ring of his hammer against the anvil was the heartbeat of the little town. "Take about 2 hours," Samuel said, wiping soot from his massive hands. "If you're hungry, my daughter keeps a kitchen up at the house. She'll feed you fair." Caleb nodded his thanks, though he'd grown accustomed to waiting in silence, preferring his own company to that of strangers. But his stomach had been empty since dawn, and the thought of a proper meal was enough to overcome his natural reticence. The Dawson house stood at the edge of town, a modest structure with a porch that wrapped around like loving arms. Roses grew wild along the fence, their last blooms of the season clinging stubbornly to thorned stems. And standing on that porch, with the afternoon light catching the copper in her hair, was a woman who made Caleb Mercer forget, for just a moment, how to breathe. Her name was Evangeline. She wasn't beautiful in the way of painted women in fancy parlors. No, her beauty was something rawer, more honest. It lived in the strength of her jaw, the steady calm of her gray eyes, the capable hands that had clearly known hard work. She wore a simple dress of faded blue, and her hair was pulled back in a practical braid that fell past her shoulders. "You must be the drifter with the lame horse," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only a statement of fact. "Come in. I've got stew on the stove." Caleb ate in her kitchen while she moved about her work, and he found himself watching her in a way he hadn't watched anyone in years. She spoke easily of simple things, the weather, the town, her father's work, and slowly, like ice melting in spring, Caleb found himself answering back. She asked about his travels, and he told her things he'd never told another living soul, about the war, about the brother he'd buried in a field with no name, about the years of wandering, searching for something he couldn't define. Evangeline listened without interruption, and when he finished, she simply nodded and refilled his coffee cup. "A man can run a long time," she said quietly, "but eventually, he's got to decide what he's running toward instead of what he's running from." That night, Caleb slept in the livery next to his horse, but he didn't sleep well. Evangeline Dawson's words echoed in his mind like the tolling of that crooked church bell. He stayed in Thornwood. At first, he told himself it was just until winter passed. Samuel Dawson offered him work at the forge, and Caleb discovered he had an aptitude for the craft. There was something satisfying in taking raw metal and shaping it into something useful. It reminded him that broken things could be mended, that destruction wasn't the only legacy a man's hands could leave behind, but it was Evangeline who truly anchored him. They took to walking together in the evenings, along the creek that ran behind the town where cottonwoods dropped their leaves like golden coins into the water. She told him about her mother, who had passed from fever 5 years prior, about her dreams of someday seeing the ocean, about the loneliness that came from being a woman of 26 in a town with more cattle than eligible men. "The young ones all went west for gold," she said with a wry smile. "The old ones are already married or too set in their ways. My father worries I'll end up alone." Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching the water catch the dying light. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked. "Being alone?" Evangeline stopped walking and turned to face him. The setting sun painted her in shades of amber and rose, and Caleb felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought long dead. "I've been alone my whole life, Mr. Mercer," she said plainly, "even when I was surrounded by people. I reckon true loneliness isn't about the absence of others. It's about the absence of being truly known." She paused, her gray eyes holding his. "And truly wanted?" He wanted to tell her then. Wanted to confess that in the weeks he'd known her, she'd become the first thing he thought of when he woke, and the last thing on his mind when he closed his eyes. But the words wouldn't come. He'd spent too many years building walls to tear them down so easily. So instead, he simply nodded, and they walked back to town in silence. Winter came hard that year. The snows piled high against the buildings, and the wind howled like a wounded thing through the empty streets. Caleb worked the forge alongside Samuel, and in the evenings he found himself increasingly welcome at the Dawsons' supper table. Evangeline had a way of drawing him out, of asking the questions that cut straight to the heart of things. She didn't waste words on trivial matters. When she spoke, it was with intention, and Caleb found himself respecting her more with each passing day. One night, as a blizzard raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Samuel Dawson excused himself early, complaining of a headache that Caleb suspected was more diplomatic than genuine. Evangeline sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I need to speak plainly with you, Caleb," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I'm not a woman who believes in games or pretense. Life is too short and too hard for such foolishness." Caleb set down his own cup, his heart beginning to beat faster despite himself. "I'm listening," he said. Evangeline held his gaze without flinching. "I am 27 come spring," she began. "I have spent my best years caring for my father and waiting for a future that never seemed to arrive. I have watched other women marry and bear children and build lives of meaning, while I remained here, useful but unfulfilled." She paused, and Caleb saw something vulnerable flash across her features before she continued. "You are the first man I have ever met who makes me feel seen. Truly seen. Not as Samuel Dawson's spinster daughter, not as the woman who cooks and cleans and tends the garden, but as myself, as Evangeline." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Evangeline, let me finish," she said, holding up a hand. "I know you carry wounds. I know the war left scars that don't show on your skin. I know you've spent years convincing yourself that you don't deserve happiness, that you're meant to wander alone until the earth claims you." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "But I'm asking you to consider another path. I'm asking you to stay, not just for the winter, not just until your restlessness returns, but for good." She drew a steadying breath. She spoke plainly of bearing your children if he would take her. "Those are words my grandmother once said to my grandfather, and I find myself wanting to say them to you." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Caleb stared at her, this remarkable woman who had laid her heart bare before him without shame or hesitation. He thought of all the years he'd wasted, all the miles he'd traveled, all the cold nights he'd spent convincing himself that he was better off alone. And then he thought of her, of the way she laughed when something genuinely amused her, of the way she hummed while she worked, of the steady strength in her hands and the gentle wisdom in her eyes. "Why?" he heard himself ask. "Why would you want a man like me, broken, haunted, with nothing to offer but a scarred past and uncertain future?" Evangeline smiled then, and it was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen. "Because you're not broken, Caleb Mercer. You're just unfinished. And I'd like very much to see what you become when you finally allow yourself to be whole." She stood and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling before his chair so that their eyes were level. "I don't need promises of wealth or status. I don't need grand gestures or pretty words. I need a partner, someone to share the work and the worry and the joy, someone to grow old with, to build a life with." She reached out and took his hands in hers, someone who will still be here when the morning comes. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, hers small and capable, his large and calloused from years of hard labor. Something broke open inside him, something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. "I've never been much good at staying," he admitted, his voice rough. "Every place I've ever been, I've left. It's all I know how to do." "Then let me teach you something different," Evangeline said. "Let me show you what it means to belong somewhere, to someone." He lifted his gaze to hers, and in her steady gray eyes, he saw not pity, not charity, but something far more terrifying and wonderful. He saw faith, faith in him, in the man he could become if he only had the courage to try. "I can't promise I won't fail you," he said quietly. "I can't promise I won't wake in the night with old demons clawing at my mind. I can't promise I'll be the husband you deserve." "I'm not asking for promises of perfection," Evangeline replied. "I'm asking for promises of presence, of trying, of choosing to stay even when the leaving would be easier." Caleb was silent for a long moment, and outside, the wind continued its mournful song. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight, something was being born. "Yes," he said finally, the word feeling strange and right on his tongue. "Yes, I will take you, Evangeline Dawson. And I will give you children, if God grants us such blessing. And I will stay. Every morning, I will choose to stay." Evangeline's eyes shone with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Then that's enough," she whispered. "That's more than enough." They were married in the little church with the crooked steeple on the first day of spring, when the snow was finally retreating from the hills and the first brave wildflowers were pushing up through the thawing earth. Samuel Dawson gave his daughter away, with tears streaming down his weathered face, and the whole town turned out to witness the union of the blacksmith's daughter and the drifter who'd finally stopped drifting. In the years that followed, Caleb Mercer became known not for his fast draw or his wandering ways, but for the quality of his ironwork and the love he bore his family. Evangeline gave him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and their home rang with laughter and life. There were hard times, as there always are, winters that seemed endless, droughts that threatened the crops, moments when old ghosts stirred in Caleb's mind and the open road called to him with its seductive whisper. But always he stayed. He stayed because he'd finally found what he'd been searching for across all those empty miles. Not a place, but a person. Not an escape, but a belonging. And when people asked him how a notorious drifter had become such a devoted family man, Caleb Mercer would smile and say that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to speak plainly, one woman courageous enough to ask for what she wanted, and one man wise enough at long last to say yes. The wind still comes down from the mountains every autumn, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of frost. But now, when it reaches the town of Thornwood, it finds the Mercer homestead glowing with warmth, with the smell of good cooking drifting from the kitchen, and the sound of children playing in the yard. And sometimes, if you listen close, you can hear the ring of a hammer on an anvil, steady and or the heartbeat of a man who finally found his home.